There was a time when those calling Russia a mafia state and Putin a terrorist were in the minority, and who were even thought of as extreme voices. My guest today was one of those people who, along with a handful of other writers and journalists like Edward Lucas and David Satter, called Putin out early, while his oppressive regime was just starting to flex its muscles. Luke Harding has observed Russia's descent into tyrannical absolutism and terrorism over many years, and charted the malign influence of that country abroad as exercised in wars, energy politics, and active measures. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe if you like our guest speakers, as it helps other people to discover the content we create, as well as the many fantastic voices on the channel. Luke Harding is a foreign correspondent for The Guardian. He was based in Russia for The Guardian from 2007 until returning from a stay in the UK on February the 5th, 2011, he was refused re-entry to Russia and deported the same day. His expulsion was likely linked with his articles critical to Russia. His 2011 book, Mafia State, discusses his experiences in Russia and the political system under Vladimir Putin, which he clearly describes as a mafia state. Today, we're going to be discussing his latest gripping book, Invasion, which covers the war in Ukraine. Luke, welcome so much to the channel.
Hi, Jonathan. Good to be with you.
Well, let's dive straight into the questions, because I've got a bunch of questions to ask you, and you've been doing some incredible reportage on the conflict, and you've now captured some of that analysis and impressions in your latest book. Can you tell me, really, what sort of drove you to write that book now, even though the outcome of the conflict is not yet known?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, as you were saying in the intro, I've been following Russia for a long time now, about 15 years, and it wasn't really that I was obsessed with the country. It's merely that I think what I kind of concluded from my 4 years there before I was thrown out was that this was not just a kind of regime that was domestically oppressive. I mean, we've seen lots of evidence of that, of protesters being, beaten up and put into vans in the center of Moscow and in other cities. We've seen the opposition, the sort of outside the system, the movement of Alexei Navalny rolled up, Navalny himself poisoned and then jailed. And we've seen a sort of return to Soviet methods of control and intimidation. I mean, that much was clear. But what I always sort of strongly believed was that Russia was also internationally dangerous. And there was plenty of evidence of that, including when I was there. I mean, I covered the war in Georgia, which everyone's forgotten about, in the August of 2008, when Russian tanks were rolling towards the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, and essentially it was a kind of attempt to stop Ukraine from joining NATO and integrating with the European Union and the West. And it was just a rather brutal lesson in sort of neighborhood realpolitik from Vladimir Putin. And so, I mean, I've been covering Ukraine since that period. I was in Ukraine in 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea and kickstarted essentially a sort of artificially created military conflict in the east of the country. I was in Donetsk and Luhansk, and was basically kind of meddling violently in Ukraine's kind of internal affairs, and so when in the autumn of last year, the autumn of 2021, Putin sent tanks and armored vehicles to Ukraine's borders, to Belarus, over the bridge he'd constructed into occupied Crimea. I did not read this as a bluff. I mean, with Putin, basically, if you have a bad option and a worse option, always pick the worse option. And a lot of people were saying, no, it's not going to happen. There was skepticism in Kiev, including from the government of Volodymyr Zelensky, which didn't believe it or didn't really want to believe it. And meanwhile, we had absolutely grim intelligence assessments and warnings from Washington and from London saying, no, this is for real. And I think, I decided to write the book when on February the 24th, when I was in Kiev, and the first bombs fell. And it was clear to me that this was a turning point in history. I mean, it was the first major, kind of the biggest European war for 80 years since 1945. And I just thought, this is an epochal moment. And it was important to write about it, to interpret it, to explain the backstory, and tell the human story as well of those people who were caught up in this conflict.
And it's extraordinary, isn't it, how through the conflict we have started to look back and reinterpret the past. So you mentioned Georgia, and that's a sort of Ukraine conflict in in miniature, isn't it? With the with the staged provocations, the fact that Russia already occupied a part of Georgian territory and behind the scenes engineered that crisis. But in that instance, they managed to make it look like Georgia was to blame. And they were much better at manipulating public opinion abroad, much better at manipulating political relationships through energy policy and so on.
Yeah, I mean that's right, and also, I mean, at that particular moment, Dmitry Medvedev was Russia's president, and Putin was prime minister. I mean, the joke in Moscow at the time was that that there was a Medvedev camp in the Kremlin, which was supposedly more liberal than the hawkish sort of Putin guys, but it was not clear whether Medvedev was in the Medvedev camp. And of course, it was Medvedev who articulated this doctrine, or pseudo doctrine, you might call it, that Russia had privileged interests, was his phrase, in the former Soviet backyard. In other words, they could call the shots, and I mean, it was clear that the Russian political elite never really accept. I mean, Putin's been very clear that he regards the collapse of the Soviet Union as a geopolitical catastrophe, the biggest of the 20th century, but never really accepted the kind of key idea that these states were independent, that had, a sovereign identity, can make their own foreign and political choices, whether that's joining NATO or not joining NATO or whatever. Essentially, that they felt that Moscow should still control these satellites. And when there was someone like Viktor Yanukovych in power, that essentially the sort of pro-Kremlin ruler of Ukraine elected in 2010, then that was okay. That was okay because essentially he would not do anything antithetical to Moscow's interests. And of course, the reason this whole crisis started 8 years ago was because Yanukovych tore up an association agreement with the European Union, which would have put Ukraine on a pro-Western course, and accepted a financial bailout from Russia. In other words, a large bribe. And there were street protests in similarly cold weather than that we have at the moment. This week across Europe, it's been snowing in Kiev, it's snowing where I am, and people sort of spent weeks protesting in the Maidan, in the main central square of Kiev, in sub-zero temperatures. And for a long time, these demonstrations were peaceful. And then Yanukovych, I think, acting under pressure from Russia, decided to get nasty. People started being beaten up, being taken away, disappearing, turning up dead. And then, of course, this culminated with his security forces shooting dead about 100 unarmed protesters in the center of Kiev, and him fleeing to Russia. An episode which Putin characterized as an American coup. And of course, it was nothing of the kind. But ultimately, it was about the future of Ukraine and what you might characterize as an anti-colonial movement. And that anti-colonial movement is still going on now. That is why Ukraine is fighting. That is why Ukrainians are volunteering to shoot Russian soldiers and sometimes to die in the process. I mean, an awful lot of people have been killed. And this is a fight against Russian chauvinism, and I think it's also a fight that Ukraine will ultimately win.
And there's so many questions that spring out of that. I think you've almost certainly answered the one I was going to lead to next, which of course was whether you were expecting the war to happen, because there were many commentators, and on the Russian side, usually people who are extraordinarily insightful into what's happening in Russia. I think in particular of the satirist Viktor Shenderovich and others, they were saying, no, this is a bluff. This is an extreme diplomatic move. I think there are many, even internally within Russia, who misinterpreted the signs. But yeah, if you've lived in Russia or been in Russia for a considerable period of time, like you have, I think you develop a certain level of cynicism, which,
I mean, yes, and also, of course, the Kremlin denied it. I mean, let's not forget, until the invasion happened, they said this was all hysteria and just Western media nonsense, and again, wrong by America, wrong by the UK, etc. And it turned out it was all completely true. what was being said. And I still think one of the things I try and explore in Invasion, in chapter 2, is what you might call late Putin, the fact that this dictator has become more and more lost in a sort of historical fantasy world where when he goes to bed at night, he dreams about Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Stalin. It's this sort of mashup of imperial and Soviet and Tsarist history, and he's been brooding on his role, on his legacy. And he published this extraordinary essay basically arguing that Ukrainians and Russians were one people, and that Ukraine was never a thing, that it was never a state, that the land that Ukraine occupies is historical Russia. And the villain of the piece, amazingly, this essay was Lenin, who gave autonomy to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic in the 1920s. And plus he takes a swipe at the West, that he blames the Poles, the Mongols, the Americans, etc. And Putin has decided that he is the person who's going to redeem this land and go down in history as the man who created another Russian empire, made Russia great again, to coin a phrase. That was the ambition, and it's crazy. It's metaphysical. It's got a kind of religious component. It's all about restoring Russian orthodoxy as well in Ukraine. And actually, bluntly speaking, the operation has been a disaster. I mean, it really hasn't gone the way he anticipated. He expected to be able to seize Kiev in a matter of days and to subdue the whole country by summer. That seems to be in the plan, and to install a kind of pro-Russian puppet administration, which would have been the kind of pro-peace party. So the plan was all there. And of course, he completely underestimated Ukrainians. I mean, he thought they were just kind of rural Russians led by a corrupt pro-Western elite that was very, very thin. And in fact, he's ended up fighting a country of 40 million plus people. So the Ukrainian army, but also the population who don't want the Russians to be there in areas that have been occupied. And I think he now has he's now in a mess, and he has to sort of figure out what he does, whether he tries to conquer the whole of the Donbass, which seems to be the current plan, or whether at some stage he pauses and tries to negotiate a peace. But the point is, the Ukrainians will not stop. They will keep going. President Zelensky's made it very clear that they intend to deoccupy everything, so including Donetsk and Luhansk, including Crimea, and we'll have to see what next year brings. But I think my feeling is that momentum is still very much with Ukraine, and I can see more Ukrainian gains, particularly in the south.
And I think Ukrainians, something you said there, they understand the region, they understand Russia probably far better than most in the West do. The Baltics also understand it. If you speak to anyone from the Baltics, they'll be able to talk about their grandparents, especially if they're part of the intelligentsia or any kind of political class. They will have lost multiple relatives to the kind of filtration, deportation, torture and murder that we're now seeing in Ukraine. So that sort of historical, even familial knowledge of how Russians behave at scale and the brutality of it is fresh. Whereas there seems to be a constant approach in the West to try and normalize Russia, to try and see Russia's behavior through almost a Western lens and to soften in some ways the brutality of it. And even when you have sort of war crimes, I think a lot of reports don't dig down into what is actually driving it. And it's extremely sinister forces that drive, I think, a lot of the executions and disappearances we see, especially of intellectuals, artists, musicians, a form of sort of cultural genocide, in fact.
Yeah, and no, I think that's right. I mean, there's sort of several things going on here. One, I think, is a serial failure by Western countries, excluding, as you say, the Poles and perhaps the Baltic states who understood all along, but to sort of basically not really understand how the kind of KGB Russian, KGB sort of trained Russian government thinks. They think that they're basically involved in a war with the West, that yes, they're fighting in Ukraine, but essentially the enemy is America and NATO and its allies. And of course, that's not true. but that's how they perceive it, almost as if it's almost a kind of end of days fight. And the problem is, until recently, until February the 24th, I think Putin would do egregious things, whether it's murdering dissidents like Alexander Litvinenko, invading Georgia, annexing Crimea, trying to poison Sergei Skripal in Salisbury. And the reaction was always a little bit feeble and conventional. And so he would sort of keep going. And I think he really thought that with Ukraine there would be words of outrage, but actually the West would, reluctantly kind of accept the situation and accept Ukraine's takeover by Russian troops. And of course, what we've seen actually has been a really quite formidable and so far robust anti-Kremlin coalition led by the Biden administration, which has provided more military aid to Ukraine than anyone else, 20 times more than the next country, which is the UK. But also a sort of a popular upsurge of support for Ukraine from ordinary people who've housed Ukrainian refugees, who've driven minivans full of warm clothes and aid to Ukraine, who have been engaged with the subject. And also, what's been interesting is it's been cross-party. I mean, with the exception of a few people in the Republican Party in the States, pretty much everybody, even the Italian government, which is run by the far right, has been supporting the Ukrainian cause. So I think sort of Putin miscalculated on the cultural response. And just to go to your other point, you're right. I mean, I've talked to Anne Applebaum, the historian, about this, and there are clear, chilling parallels between what the NKVD did, the secret police, in Eastern and Central Europe in the 40s, during the war and subsequently, and what's happening now. And what's happening now really is an attempt to de-Ukrainize Ukraine, to get rid of its language, its culture, its identity, its cultural symbols, whether it's blowing up statues of Taras Shevchenko, Ukraine's national poet, which I've seen, or putting a bullet through Shevchenko's head, or whether it's abducting Ukrainian kids and re-educating them, or introducing the Russian curriculum, and burning Ukrainian books. I mean, the project, when you take a step back from it, is breathtaking and basically genocidal. I mean, this is Zelensky's allegation, and hard to disagree with that when you see what's been happening. And I think in Putin's head there's an idea that either you can make Ukrainians into good Russians, and if you can't make them to good Russians, you have to kill them. But that those are basically the options. So those who can be cajoled, made to collaborate, made to kind of accept the new reality, they can live. But those who have a kind of pronounced pro-Ukrainian position, or were members of the police, or the old authorities, they have to be executed. And that's what we've seen on a big scale in the Kiev region, in occupied Kherson Oblast, and in Kharkiv in the northeast. Every zone of Russian occupation I go to, I end up watching bodies being pulled out of the earth.
And Belarus provides quite an interesting template, doesn't it? Because you talked about language being a real target of this approach. Now, the Belarus language over the last 30 years has seen a significant decline, and it's become, from being sort of relatively widespread, you can really only now find it in sort of, provincial setting, in villages, and it tends to be the old generation who speak it. And I heard an interesting perspective from some of the Ukrainians that I'm talking to, is that the erosion of the Belarus language is one of the reasons why Russian propaganda has proved to be quite effective in helping to suppress the Belarus independence movement. And another point was that much of the artistic and intellectual elite has either been imprisoned or had to flee the country. So that process of Russification triumphed in Belarus, and the Ukrainians would have seen that happening, would have had a lot of reports from friends, even relatives, through that process. So there's a clear warning there from recent history.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also what's interesting is just how many Ukrainians are dumping the Russian language and switching to Ukrainian. Now everybody is bilingual in Ukraine. Both languages are spoken and understood. And despite what sort of Russian propaganda says, it's perfectly okay to speak Russian pretty much everywhere. I mean, I speak Russian all the time. in Kiev and elsewhere, and obviously cities like Kharkiv and Kherson and Kryvyi Rih, President Zelensky's hometown. I mean, he's a native Russian speaker. They're all Russophone, but people are making a kind of civic choice. They're basically rejecting the Putinite idea that if you speak Russian, therefore you are, you should be under Russian control. You should be a Russian citizen, and that they have their own Ukrainian identity, which is Ukrainian. It's European. It's westward looking. And the country has changed a great deal since 2014. I mean, that this process of Ukrainization has been going on. And of course, Ukrainians point out that for centuries, their language was suppressed. I mean, it's not just in areas occupied newly by Russian troops where Ukraine is being wiped out and removed from libraries and from school curricula. But in the 19th century, it was banned for much of it under a series of imperial edicts. You couldn't put on a play in Ukrainian. You couldn't publish in Ukrainian. And this ban was only really revoked in 1905. And then, of course, there was another wave of Russification, Sovietization under Stalin. I mean, there was a brief sort of flourishing in the 1920s under Lenin, but then subsequently, the Ukrainian language was forbidden again, and there was the Great Famine of 1932 and 1933, in which nearly 4 million people died, and so Ukrainians understandably mistrust Moscow, mistrust the state. They're a very interestingly kind of network society, a horizontal society, as I write in Invasion, and I think kind of slowly and surely Russian will stop being spoken in Ukraine. And the thing is, these are individual choices. There's no one saying you cannot speak Russian. I mean, people do speak Russian. You can hear Russian on the streets of Kiev. You can fall in love in Russian. You can order in Russian, etc. But I think there is a move now to the Ukrainian language, which is becoming unstoppable.
And it's an interesting point, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russians were able to pass off the historic crimes for a period of time, and they were able to put a label on it, which is the Soviet Union. And that wasn't us. We were also dominated. And to an extent, they were given a free pass. I remember being there in the 90s, and the country was in a parlous state. They'd lost empire, and there was a huge nostalgia for this sense of lost prestige. But nonetheless, Russia did not have the taint of the Soviet Union's crimes. What Putin seems to have done is, by turning the clock back to a mishmash of Soviet and Tsarist nostalgia, and through this war, he has put a stain on Russian culture, Russian history, Russian language, and is now forcing a reinterpretation, not just of recent history, but longer-term history through a decolonization lens. Russian studies is in turmoil. The journalistic practice of, where people are based and how they view events, all of these are now being looked through quite a different lens than they would have been, say, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and the cultural thing is interesting. I mean, there were billboards in Kherson featuring Pushkin, saying that Kherson is a Russian city. I mean, but Pushkin's been absolutely instrumentalized in all this, and Tolstoy and so on. And meanwhile, Russian soldiers have been destroying any kind of Ukrainian monument, especially to what happened in 2014. That's all been erased. And bizarrely, they've been putting up statues of Lenin again. I mean, Lenin has made a comeback in places like Genichesk, which is now the kind of new operating headquarters for Russian administration in Kherson. It's a small, sleepy little seaside town overlooking Crimea that I visited in January, but just before the war started, or the large-scale war started. So Lenin is back, and that makes no sense, because Putin was blaming Lenin for creating Ukraine, and yet there he is as being celebrated as a symbol of sort of Soviet culture. And I think it just speaks to the ideological vacancy at the heart of this project. It's not entirely clear why Putin has gone to war. I mean, originally he said it was a special operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, which again is preposterous given the fact that Ukraine is run by a Jewish president, has a Jewish prime minister, and Zelensky's relatives, many of them perished in the Holocaust, and his father fought the Nazis in the Red Army, his grandfather. So it's all a bit of a nonsense. And then latterly they've been talking about It's a war against Satanism and Western decadence. So, and you know, perhaps next year we'll get another explanation for why Russia is fighting. And I mean, the significance of this is that, you know, Russian troops don't quite know why they're there. Actually, in the early days, they ran around asking, "Where are the Nazis?" And you know, the Ukrainian soldiers, conversely, know precisely why they're there, to defend their country, to defend their families, their homes, their language, their way of life, and their right to choose and to be free, actually, at the most basic level. So this kind of attempt to sort of play on a yearning for kind of cultural nostalgia, you know, but yearning for the Soviet Union. I mean, it works on a few older people, and it was a trick that was played in, you know, it was a sort of trick that was played in 2014 with some success in the east of the country, but now it no longer works. There's not a constituency for that anymore, unfortunately, apart from a few old people.
And again, you know, we try to look at Putin, and there's endless, you know, articles and interviews that try to rationalize his decision-making process, that try to, you know, understand whether he's taken a nationalist turn or whether he believes these ridiculous sort of pseudo historical articles that he's been penning over the last couple of years. But actually, if we look at his actions through the concept of active measures, which is that you actually have no philosophy, you have no point of view. What you do is whatever makes your enemy weaker. Then somehow the sort of mishmash of ideologies that he's pulled together, that perhaps makes more sense if you look at him as a spy, as an operative, of the prime purpose being to make Russia stronger, but to make her enemies weaker at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the unifying idea here is the idea of Russia as a great power, with great power privileges, and a kind of imperial Russia, essentially. I mean, this is what's happening in Ukraine is a classic imperial takeover attempt to crush a rebellious former colony and to reabsorb it into the great imperium. I mean, that's the project. Whatever ideological facade it's given, and it's quite interesting how his ideas essentially 19th century ideas, or which are kind of chauvinistic ideas, and I mean, I kind of explore this in my book. I think that Ukraine is necessary for Russia to be an empire. You know, without Ukraine, it's not really an empire, actually. But I think ultimately the threat that Ukraine poses is one of example, because there are millions of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Now, if Ukraine can integrate with the West, if it can become a successful, prosperous democracy, a member of NATO, let's say, a member of the European Union, but basically part of kind of European democratic space, then why can't Russia? You know, because Russia, you know, Russia similarly is full of millions of Russian speakers. And of course, that's not what Putin wants, because what Putin has done with Russia is to take it from, you know, when he inherited Russia, it was basically, I don't know if you agree, but it was basically a sort of semi-democracy. I mean, it wasn't fully democratic, but it had some democratic elements to it. I mean, and at least as a minimum, Boris Yeltsin could be criticized and mocked on Russian TV. And what we've seen under Putin is the state's grown darker and darker. When I was there, I would describe it as authoritarian. Now I would say it's totalitarian. I think it's pretty close to sort of full-blown totalitarian dictatorship, where any form of dissent is a crime, where opponents of the regime are locked up on spurious charges and given extraordinarily long punitive jail sentences, where critics are routinely murdered, where businessmen mysteriously fall out of windows, and where anyone can come plunge into the mincer. It's a place of arbitrary, unchecked power, and where actually a lot of young Russians who don't fancy fighting and dying in the war have voted with their feet and have fled to the Baltics, to Armenia, to Georgia, and so it's become a gloomy and chilling place, where the state propaganda gets louder and louder and louder, where also I think the regime is looking more and more fragile.
I'd certainly agree. I mean, in the 90s, there was the inklings of institutions starting to emerge, or you know, a culture of discussion, but with obviously a long way to go. But I think when I was talking to Yuri Felshchinsky, he pointed out that there has not been a democratic transition of power, a fully peaceful transition of power via a transparent election. Even the transition from Yeltsin to Putin in some ways was stage managed to a significant degree. So I think, yeah, talking about democracy in Russia, it's never had a fully fledged transition of power under a democratic system. But as you say, there were some institutions and there was culture of free expression starting to emerge. Putin has, over the last 20 years, eroded every single institution or free behavior, and I believe managed to taint everything that existed. The church is tainted by the secret services. It's clearly run at the higher echelons by former KGB agents. Culture is driven by nepotism, or at least those that get onto TV. So I see Putin as both eroding institutions, but also institutionalizing a kind of nepotism, which means that if you have any kind of dissent whatsoever, you will not be considered, part of whether it be cultural, political, or any kind of social elite, and possibly even you'll be excluded from being able to, become rich, successful, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two things going on, two projects in sort of contemporary Russia. One is the ultra-nationalistic project, which has kind of led to this terrible war. But the other, which I've sort of documented in previous books of mine, Shadow State was the one before invasion, and Mafia State as well, is corruption. I spent a long time investigating the corruption of Putin and his circle, and what we can say, and I've seen the documents in very many cases, is that they've accumulated billions of dollars, not through talent, but just because power is money, and that Putin arguably is the richest guy in the world. I mean, he perhaps formally not. I mean, this money is not formally his, but it's held by a series of proxies and by oligarchs, some of whom have been recently sanctioned, some of whom who haven't, and who control Russia's abundant natural resources, whether it's oil, gas, or whatever. And he can instrumentalize this wealth. I mean, he can use it for sort of personal pleasure, whether it's a yacht or that ludicrous overblown palace he had built in Sochi and denied was his, although everyone knew it was his. And he can use it for political projects, for subversion, for sabotage, for throwing elections, for funding far-right parties in Europe and elsewhere, for backing the left. I mean, that's the other traditional sort of vector in Soviet times, the sort of far left. But mostly these days, the focus is on the sort of Eurosceptic, xenophobic, conservative or ultra-conservative right, including in America. And so the money can be used for all sorts of things, but basically Russia is fantastically corrupt. And this was the other category error made by Western politicians over the last couple of decades, was to treat Putin like a politician. It would have been better to treat him like a gangster, and think the guy you're dealing with is a gangster who sometimes murders people, sometimes doesn't, but who essentially is only interested in a deal. He's interested in dealing. And if he can't deal, if he can't get what he wants, then he believes it's a conspiracy. So he's not a Democrat. He'll never be a Democrat. And it was actually Garry Kasparov. I've talked to him about this, and he made this point, that if you want to understand Putin, forget about reading, scholarly research. Just go to a bookshelf and pick up a copy of Mario Puzo's The Godfather, and it's all there.
I heard you speaking to Misha Glenny a couple of years ago about this topic, and around the same time, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and it was actually the Guardian building alone. He had a big event in that lecture theatre you've got at the Guardian. And I remember the audience when he said this, he was asked, "What should you do with Putin?" I think it was around 2000 and. It must have been 2008, so it's quite a few years ago, or maybe no, he wasn't let out then, was he? No, it would have been about 5 or 6 years ago.
2012, I think he got
2012. So it would have been about 2016 probably. But he was asked that question: "How do you deal with Putin?" He just said, "Don't. Don't make deals. Don't deal with him. Don't treat him like a statesman. You have to see him as something quite different." I think this is the other mistake that is continuously made, even now, is to imagine that somehow there is a well of opposition within Russian society, that somehow from whether it be opposition sources or even within the Duma or the media, there is somehow this groundswell of alternative government, proto-liberal government in waiting. But my understanding is that what he's managed to build up is a facade of a democratic pluralistic system. But if you have a public voice, if you're a politician, even many of the leading Yabloko politicians, if you were in any way to go off script, you couldn't serve that public role. So you're looking at an entire sort of Potemkin village, an entire facade of a sort of hybrid democratic system, whereas in actual fact, behind the scenes, almost everybody in public life is either made their peace with the regime or in some way is bought or doesn't have the capacity to act independently.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, that those sort of pluralistic elements are entirely fake. It was a sort of postmodern sort of authoritarian system. Now, as I said, I was arguing it's kind of totalitarian. And the great tragedy is that most Russians support the war. I mean, I think there's a sort of passionate minority who are in favor of it. There's an equally kind of strong minority who oppose it. Many of those people have left. I mean, particularly sort of younger people, particularly people from Moscow and St. Petersburg. A lot of them have fled. I mean, the educated creative classes have gone, but the majority are sort of passively in favor. And I think, I mean, there are several reasons for that, but the main one is that propaganda works. I mean, we were talking earlier about the savagery that the Russian soldiers have meted out on the Ukrainian population when they encounter them, and to a large degree, that's because that's what they've seen on the TV screens. They've just been told Ukrainians are not people. Ni ljudi is the phrase. That they're savages, that they're vermin, that they're rats, that they're Untermensch, to use the German term, and it's worked. They think this. And it's astonishing, and so the war has come. The war hasn't come from nowhere. It's come from somewhere. Ukraine has been an obsession with Putin for a long time, for a long time, and I think it's basically fascistic. I mean that's the other point. I think what we're looking at is 21st century Russian fascism, and even as late as January of this year, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, perhaps sincerely, perhaps not, was kept on calling Putin, flying to Moscow, trying to talk to him, as if he was an interlocutor who could be reasoned with, was interested in finding a mutual solution, that perhaps, if he got the right concessions, would back down. I mean, Putin wasn't interested in any of that, and he just interprets those kind of overtures as a weakness. He thinks the West is weak, he thinks his representatives are weak, he thinks his politicians are ephemeral, here today, gone tomorrow. And he wants to exploit this weakness for his own purposes. And actually, the place we are now, I think, first of all, Ukraine has to win the war, and the West has to continue to supply Ukraine with weapons so it can liberate more of its territory. But I think we're just in a place with containment. I mean, we can't wait for some democratic uprising in Russia, which will overthrow the Putin regime. We just need to be clear-eyed and contain Russia as the US and its allies did in the years during the Cold War. I mean, it's the long telegram. It's George Kennan. It's absolutely the place that we're at, and it's not that I'm some kind of hawk. It's just we have to acknowledge the kind of Russia we're dealing with now, which is aggressive, violent, revisionist, and that if it's not stopped in Ukraine, we'll keep going.
And really, the question I like to sort of end on is looping back to something you said earlier, that this is an incredibly historic year. And that's one of the reasons I started the podcast, is just it just felt that this was a pivotal moment in history, perhaps one that Russia hasn't seen since 1917, and absolutely critical, or even 1905, these huge turning points in history. And I think the invasion of Ukraine itself, the fact that the post-World War II order has been ripped up to an extent, I think that will prove to be the least impactful event that's happened, whereas Putin's catastrophic weakening of the Russian economy, forcing out hundreds of thousands of the most educated and talented proto-middle class, and destroying its industrial base, and as well as its the credibility of its energy and military sectors as well as export industries. I think that is going to unwind over a number of years, isn't it? So I'm not going to ask you to make predictions, but what is done is catastrophically weaken further Russia and the concept of Russia as an imperial territory.
Yeah, I mean, Russia does look pretty weak. I mean, not least because the whole Ukraine invasion was a hubristic project. I mean, as I said, they thought they would win quickly and pretty effortlessly, and in fact, they're now kind of stuck in this kind of grinding struggle where it's taken 7 months to advance a couple of kilometers around Bakhmut. I mean, they are, you know, they get 50 meters every day, but at what cost? With perhaps 70,000 Russian soldiers killed, Russia deintegrated, decoupled from the Western economy, as you say, and just, you know, I don't know if you went to McDonald's when you were in Moscow in the 90s, but that just sort of modern life has kind of vanished, together with more than 1,000 firms, whether they're kind of, you know, lingerie or accounting services or or kind of high street chains or fast food restaurants. I mean, they've all gone, and Russia's sort of essentially kind of gone backwards. And Putin, obviously, you know, he's indifferent to this, to the price that's being paid, and he just has this sort of shimmering historical vision in front of him. And he's now 70 years old. But I sort of think, I mean, you know, I wouldn't predict that his regime is about to fall. I mean, I don't think there's going to be a palace coup. I mean, the kind of power guys, the Siloviki, the generals, that they're still very much in control of the situation, and those most likely to rise up and rebel have either done that and been imprisoned, or they have left the country. But my sense is, I mean, I don't know what the ending will be, but I think we are towards the end of Putin. Shakespeare, if this is a Shakespearean play, this is Act 5, Scene 1 or 2.
But not the end of the Siloviki.
I don't know what the end of the play will be quite. Whose body will be on the stage, but I don't see Putin going on until 2034. I mean, I think we're towards the end of the Vladimir Putin era. Whether it ends with a bang or a whimper, I'm not sure, but I think the curtain is coming down.
And it might, you know, the elite deposing Putin or somehow moving him aside, that doesn't actually change the fundamentals, does it? It doesn't change the fact that you have an extreme minority of nationalist sentiment. It doesn't change the fact you've got a large portion of the population who are either complicit or indifferent to change. And it doesn't change the idea that you've got an incredibly powerful FSB, KGB elite behind the scenes, willing to manipulate people's minds and actions to control the wealth of the country. I mean, that is going to be far harder to root out.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Jonathan, you know, any successor to Putin will probably be a neo-Putin or a mini Putin. I mean, or a Putin Mark II. I don't know. I don't see, unfortunately, I don't see a kind of democratic leader taking over anytime soon. But I do think when Putin goes, there will probably be some kind of pause or tactical realignment. And I suspect the war with Ukraine will either stop or be dialed down. I mean, it's very much Putin's war. And you know, he's always been a gambler. He's always relied on forced solutions. He's always sought to escalate rather than step back. But I think with this invasion, I think he's overreached. And as I say in my book, and look, here it is for anyone who hasn't seen it. Ukraine is fighting for its survival, and I think, you know, I argue in the last chapter that Ukraine is I call it a proven state. It's actually proved itself as a strong, you know, strong country, a strong nation, a strong people. And I think Ukraine will win this war. Whether that means total deoccupation of all of its territory and Crimea, I'm not sure. But Ukraine has already shown that it can survive. And Russia, by contrast, looks weaker than ever.
It's almost impossible to predict, but I think I advise people watching this channel to look out for your reportage because it's incredibly insightful. We're going to put links to the books in the description of the video as well. But I also advise people to read Mafia State, but also Conclusion, which is an extremely terrifying book, along with your latest. And I'm sure as this crisis unfolds, there'll be plenty more to explore and write about. Luke, it's been a tremendous pleasure speaking to you. I've seen you at a number of events over the past, and it's a great privilege to be able to point questions personally at you.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Enjoyed our conversation, and I appreciate your the fact that you understand the backstory and have been engaging with Russia for a long time. It shows. Great conversation. Thanks a lot.